Les Levidow, one of the founder of CAMPACC. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you. How has the UK used anti-terror powers against the Kurdish Freedom Movement?
Yes, well, this began around the year 2001 when the UK government implemented the Terrorism Act 2000 by banning 26 organizations, including the PKK. And the defiance began very quickly because Kurdish groups mobilized 6,000 demonstrators to protest against the ban. That was in May 2001. And some wore T-shirts to say, "I am PKK." So they were defying the police to arrest them. No one was arrested there, but some were arrested 2 years later, and that became an important prosecution. So the Kurdish activists were prosecuted for supposedly raising funds for the PKK. In fact, they were raising funds for a European caravan, a speaking tour about the campaign for Kurdish language rights in Turkey. And before the trial, MI5, I mean the intelligence agency, tried to blackmail one of the defendants to become a police informer in return for some help with his claim for refugee status. But he refused this blackmail proposal and went public about it. At the trial, the judge fortunately permitted witnesses to inform the jury about how the Turkish state had systematically oppressed the Kurds, including their language rights and cultural rights. So in effect, the defendants put the Turkish state on trial, and likewise, implicitly, the UK state on trial for its complicity. And the jury acquitted the defendants. So this defeat for the state deterred prosecutions afterwards. There had been very few, and certainly few with such serious charges, such as raising funds for the PKK. But the anti-terror powers gave the state broad scope for intimidating people, without bringing a criminal prosecution. In particular, a ban on any symbol of a banned terrorist organization, such as its flag, or in this case, Abdullah Öcalan. So the police have attempted to ban free expression, of the flag at Kurdish demonstrations here. But they more subtly use public order laws, on the pretext that these symbols would incite public disorder, rather than use the anti-terror powers. But the demonstrators resisted this pressure, and the turning point came in 2008 when millions of Kurds held protests throughout Turkey, Kurdistan, and European cities in response to physical attacks on Abdullah Öcalan. So the police initially refused to permit any demonstration, but then they were persuaded to allow a demonstration, but banned any flag supporting Abdullah Öcalan and the Kurdish Freedom Movement. And they created a sense of intimidation by having a special squad of police to monitor people for any infractions of this ban. But the demonstrators defied the ban. Many people displayed the flags, and no one was arrested. So in effect, the Kurdish Freedom Movement has acted as if there were no ban, and so undermined the ban in practice. And there have been no prosecutions, as far as I know, for displaying either the flag or Abdullah Öcalan. But again, the police have many other powers under the anti-terror laws to intimidate people, under pretext of simply investigating possible terrorist activities or associations. They have repeatedly raided people's houses. They have intimidated people who visit the Kurdish community centers, in order to frighten them away from visiting those places. And in particular, they have used what's called Schedule 7, a section of the Terrorism Act 2000, which allows the border authorities at any port, such as an airport or a train station, to detain someone for many hours and ask them questions and require a response. And failure or refusal to respond to any question is a terrorist crime under the Terrorism Act 2000. So people have been held for many hours, either leaving the country and so sometimes missing their flights, or when returning from another country, and have been intimidated for several hours. And what is very revealing is the type of questions, because they are generally banal questions, asking for simple information that the authorities already have. And among these questions is, would you like to help us? Meaning, would you like to become an informer? With the implication that if you help us, then we will no longer harass you every time you leave or enter the country. Now, we know the stories of those who have refused, not those who submitted to the pressure. And for those who refused, they are stopped in this way almost every time they leave or enter the country. Now, it's a way of saying two things. One, we know everything that you do. And second, we are doing this to anyone whom we are targeting to become a police informer, so that you cannot know who is a police informer and how many there might be. So the anti-terror power is used as a big strategy to create distrust among all Kurds about who might be an informer. Okay.
How has the UK used anti-terror powers against political activities by other groups?
Yes. Well, the ban on so-called terrorist organizations included all the national liberation movements, including the Tamil Tigers, and especially important because there are so many Tamils in this country, and many of them political activists who have opposed the racist state of Sri Lanka. And the Tamils have been targeted in a similar way, attempting to intimidate any expression of independence, the demands that Tamil Eelam become independent from Sri Lanka, as the only solution to the institutionally racist state oppressing the Tamils. And it takes overt forms, such as, intimidating people who carry the flag of Tamil Eelam, as well as more subtle means. Whenever a Tamil group which advocates independence has tried to book a venue to hold a public event, somehow the authorities find out immediately, and they tell the venue that this Tamil group has terrorist associations. And of course the venue becomes frightened and cancels the booking. So it became almost impossible to hold a public event While by contrast, if the group is simply protesting against abuses of human rights, then they can go ahead freely and hold a political event on that narrow theme. So you see how the anti-terror laws are used to police the Tamil community, to create a clear distinction between the acceptable and the unacceptable. Now, I mention the Tamils in particular because near the end of the war in Sri Lanka in 2009, they had enormous demonstrations of several hundred thousand people, with their flag, so defying the ban. But more importantly, many Kurdish activists attended as well. And that's how they had political conversations about how the anti-terror laws were being used against both groups and how they might develop joint activities to have a more effective resistance. So through the protests, they came to understand better each other's struggle, and that they weren't an exception to a rule, they were the rule. That is, the systematic suppression of solidarity was the state policy.
Okay. How these groups resisted the powers separately or together, especially with the Kurdish movement?
Yes. Yeah, so I gave the example of how the Kurds combined with the Tamils to defy the ban on both their flags, as symbols of so-called terrorist organizations. And then CAMPACC, helped that to happen to some extent. We also helped to bring groups together behind the scenes. So before I mention Schedule 7 of the Terrorism Act 2000, which has been used to stop thousands and thousands of Muslims, mainly because they are Muslim, as well as anyone who is seen as involved in a solidarity campaign, against the state that is allied with the UK. So a key example would be the Somalis in this country, who have been opposing the UK domination or attempt to dominate the Somali government, especially its dependency on the Kenyan government, which is an agent of the British state. And there had been some prejudice, among the Kurds against Muslims, people who identify openly as Muslims, as most Somalis do. So we brought a Somali speaker to a Kurdish meeting to describe how Somalis were systematically stopped under Schedule 7, just as Kurds were, for a similar political reason and a similar objective, to turn people into police informers. So I think this really helped both the groups to understand better and to discuss how they could resist this intimidation more effectively. So maybe that's enough on that question.
What is the source of those powers in anti-terror law? When and why did Parliament enact them?
Yes, well, this goes back to the year 2000, the Terrorism Act 2000, which may seem surprising because it came before 9/11, before the attack on the Twin Towers in New York. And the reason is that it was directed against national liberation movements, basically. Of course, they were not called that. And the clearest political reason that I have ever seen was in an expert report from 1999 by a so-called academic expert in terrorism, Paul Wilkinson. And in that report, he said, here's the problem for the British government, that a terrorist group looks internationally for any ideological, political, or diplomatic support it can obtain. Such support is typically the weapon of the weak. I mean, all these are euphemisms for oppressed groups, oppressed by racist terrorist states. So this was the rationale for permanent anti-terrorist legislation, which would ban organizations, as terrorist. And this was also the rationale to define terrorism very broadly, to include simply the threat of serious damage to property in ways designed to influence the government for a political cause. Now, if we think back several centuries of political struggle against oppressive states, almost all those struggles could fit within this new definition of terrorism. And it was used initially to justify banning many organizations, including the PKK, the Tamil Tigers, a Baloch resistance group in Pakistan, and Hamas, which later was going to win the elections in all of Palestine. Now, at the time it was passed, I mean, it was opposed by many members of parliament, and mainly in the Labour left, including the famous Tony Benn, who said its true purpose. This is an agreement among the governments of the world that no government will be challenged from inside with support from outside, meaning with solidarity, even verbal solidarity from other countries, such as from the migrant groups in this country, the Tamils, the Kurds, the Baloch, Palestinians, and so on. And this is reflected in the broad powers, not only in the broad definition of terrorism, but in the broad definition of a terrorist activity, which means almost any association, even verbal support for a banned organization, or speaking on the same platform at the same meeting as someone who is from such an organization or is suspected of association with such an organization. So it was really creating new crimes of association. Any activity which is seen as associating with a suspect person. And so it was creating what we call suspect communities. This term comes from a book by Paddy Hilliard about the Terrorism Act 1974, which was directed at the Irish communities who were protesting against British state terrorism in Northern Ireland. So he said that this anti-terror regime turned the Irish into a suspect community, and by analogy, we then said the Terrorism Act 2000 did likewise with all migrant communities and with the entire Muslim population. I mean, it also created what we call punishment without trial, a broad range of powers which can create difficulties for people's everyday lives. I mean, an extreme case is the Schedule 7 powers to stop people at ports. So these are all non-judicial executive powers which can be imposed by the Home Secretary, that is the Interior Minister, as it's called in most countries, or by any representatives in the security forces or the police. They can all impose these various punishments without trial, and the person being targeted has no simple remedy or means to appeal against these powers except by bringing a court case, which is very difficult. So these are all ways of intimidating migrant communities in this country against any association with the groups fighting against the oppressive regimes allied with the UK.
What is your message to Erdogan government to stop military operations and airstrikes to Kurdish areas and your comments about invasion attempt to Kurdistan?
Well, of course, I mean, like all solidarity groups around the world, we oppose all the Turkish aggression, certainly the military attacks, also the everyday aggression against the Kurdish people in Turkey. As the political reality, of course, Erdogan doesn't care what we say. It almost doesn't care what other governments say, but it does care about damage to its economy. So we should try to find ways to undermine the support of our governments for Turkey. For example, Britain has continued to sell arms to Turkey in all these years of its terrorist activity against the Kurds. So we have been protesting against those arms exports.
The Sweden PM Olof Palme assassination was recently closed, that case. So based on that assassination, the Kurds were criminalized and even PKK included in the list of terrorist organizations. So despite the decision made in Brussels court that the PKK is the Liberation Party and the decision that the PKK is not a terrorist organization, unfortunately, the PKK is still on the list. What role does European countries and institutions have at this point?
Yes, well, it's important to look at the basis for the decision by the Belgian court, because the basis was international law, which says, that a party to a prolonged armed conflict, by definition, cannot be a terrorist organization. Now, Belgian law provides a clearer link to that aspect of international law, and that helped our lawyer friends, in Belgium to make the strong case and to win the case in the court. But the same principle should apply in every country because it is in international law. And since that judgment in Belgium, we in Britain have held public meetings to remind people here that it has equal relevance here, and that on that principle, by definition, the PKK cannot be defined as a terrorist organization. And of course, the British government doesn't care what we say. It doesn't care about international law. And likewise, many other governments, I mean, they use or refer to international law only when it is politically convenient for their foreign or domestic policy. But the British government does care about people defying the intimidation. So I think that this argument about the PKK being a liberation movement rather than a terrorist organization is important mainly for strengthening people's self-confidence to resist the intimidation. And the more people resist and defy the intimidation, then the more difficult for the UK government to use its anti-terror powers in an effective way for its political objectives.
Les Levidow, one of the founder of CAMPACC, thank you very much for joining us today. Thanks for supporting our channel.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.